We are on the last
lesson. Provided technology and all of the
jinx ourselves.
All of the sewing gods are with us. This will be the last episode of this particular sew along
For the everybody's shirt. And
we named this everybody's shirt
body
because it is adjustable and it looks good on everybody. It's a very great staple classic with a couple little extra feminine details. So we love this shirt, and I know that a lot of you are enjoying making it as well. And I know there are a lot of you out there that are still working on your muslin, but trust this sew along will be here on Facebook as well as YouTube indefinitely. So you'll be able to pick it up as soon as you've got your pattern exactly the way you want it.
Lots of bless yous.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, there's something about textiles that make me sneeze. I probably sneeze like that 3 or 4 times a day, especially if we get a new shipment of fabric. We're not making any noise. We need to say something.
You're good at talking. So tell them what we did last week.
Okay, so last week, I know we set the sleeve. Oh, and we did the sleeve plackets. And we set the sleeves. And hopefully, if you are with me, you have top stitched your Armscye. Now, every time I do one of these, I get at least one person who says, wait a minute. You're pressing the seam allowance toward the shirt, and I thought in patterns that I've used before, you press the seam allowance toward the sleeve. Well, there are cases where you would press the seam allowance against the sleeve if you were making a coat or a jacket. But when you're making a shirt, and you can test me by looking at any ready-to-wear shirt, but you want to top stitch that seam allowance down. And you surely can't top stitch that down and have it look good if you did it on the sleeve. So you must press it toward the shirt in order to top stitch it down. And why do we top stitch it down? We top stitch it down for a good look, for a stronger and more secure Armscye. It's never going to rip out. And then also just for maintenance, because when you nail a seam down by top stitching it, it doesn't flop back and forth. And those of you who spend any time, and I know there's a whole generation that doesn't use an iron, but if you press your clothes, you've noticed that the seam will flop around in there, and if it's not nailed down. So nailing it down just makes it stay in place always, all the way through the laundry and the pressing, and just makes life a lot easier. So I like top stitching those seams down.
Deb says she's working on her second one already.
What?
She did. She started with view B, and now she's doing view A.
Okay, so you did the tunic first, and now you're doing the shorter version. So you must have really liked it. Got a good fit?
Well, she didn't say that.
Well, I wouldn't make a second one if I didn't like the pattern, so I'm sure she likes it.
All right. Well, stay with us, Deb, because we have a little info that will for sure be useful to you at the end of the video today. So, we still have quite a bit to do, so should we get moving?
Yeah. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do today is the hem. Now, you might say, why are we doing the hem before we're finished putting the side seam and underarm seam in? Well, that's because on shirt tails, there's a curve. It curves up at the hip line and then back down. And that's near impossible in some cases, depending on the arch of that curve, to actually turn the hem afterwards, because you have such a narrow amount of fabric left in that high curve. The higher the curve, the less fabric you have to fold up. And people end up having to put little pleats in there or something. all you have to do is do the hem before you do the side seam, and all of that will be eliminated. Now, in this particular pattern, and don't panic if you've already sewn up the side seams, that arch is not that high. It's not so high that you couldn't turn the hem, but as a rule of thumb, I always do the hems on a shirt tail first. So I'm following my rule of thumb, and I'm following the pattern guide today. So I'm going to do the right front hem, and I'll need a camera.
All right. I can do that. Well, the dog can't do it, so I guess it's me.
Yes. Okay, so I'll just show the shape. Let me just clean this up a little bit while you're doing that. So as I was saying, a lot of times in a shirt tail, it's going to continue to go up here.
Oops,
and be a much tighter curve. This one is not so much that way, but like I said, I'm just going to do it because that's the way I've always do it, and that's the way the pattern guide instructs you, is to do the hem before the side seams. So the first thing we're going to do is a technique called crimping. And if you've taken my no pins, no basting, you've learned a little bit about crimping. If you haven't, well, welcome aboard, because this is a great little technique. And I'm going to do this at just a healthy 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And I'll start out not crimping. Oh, turn this machine on. I'll start out not crimping because that's so straight right there. But before I get to the curve, I'm going to start crimping. Now, if you can, if you can just put the camera to the back of the foot here, Jessica, so they can see that I'm going to push this fabric right up against this. You can use a tool. If your fingers won't fit back there, if you have a slant needle, slant foot, like a Viking, it's hard to do this because of the shape of the foot. So you're going to hold that up against there. You're going to use your left hand to guide, and you're going to crimp at about a 1/4 of an inch. And it doesn't matter the seam allowance. I just have it at, or stitch length, I just have it at a 3. But hold it against there. Don't let it go. And when you get a long ways away from the curve, you can let that go. But I continue the stitching because it gives me a good indication where I have to turn my hem. So that's what it should look like. Don't flatten it out. Except for maybe right here. Okay, so now you're just going to, you're just going to double turn this. So what I want you to do is turn it just past the stitching, and then turn it one more time like that. And then we're going to top stitch along that fold there. Now trust me, even with the lawn, you can tell where that, oh doggone it, you can tell where that fold is because it is a higher lock than the rest of the hem. All right, James, forgive me, I didn't learn how to use my needle threader yet. Come on, get in there. All right, just talk among yourselves. Come on. I should put my magnifier on, I suppose. Usually I can just fake it. Oh, there's the eye. Okay.
Oh, thank you. Jillian says, since doing the no pins class, and Jillian did that with us on Zoom, I've been using the crimping method for curved hems, and they always come out perfectly.
Yeah, that's the charm of it. It looks so unorthodox, and you're so used to doing everything where you can see what you're stitching, and spending a lot of time pinning and basting. So the fact that this is just so slick and easy seems a little deceptive. So again, now that I've got that held in place, I'll come back a little further, and I'm going to again turn it just past that 1/4 inch crimping, and then push that fabric up into that curve. And if this is difficult and it's not getting up in there, you didn't crimp it enough. You need to crimp it as tight as you can, because it'll come back out. It's not permanent. And your stitching probably should be right around 3/8. This is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And we're turning it just slightly more than 1/4. And with the turn of the cloth and everything, that pretty much takes up a 5/8 inch seam allowance. However, it really doesn't matter if it's an extra 1/8 or less, because it's just the hem, and 1/8 of an inch nobody cares about in a hem. And your aim is to be stitching on that fold. I don't feel like I'm getting as close as I'd like, but let's take a look at this one. Okay, here you can see the whole back is done. I think I have a couple little crinkles. Yeah, I let it go right here, so we won't look at that one. All right.
Can you show them? Can you set it on the table to show them?
Sure.
I didn't get a good look at it.
I'll pull that tail back in, but there you go. So see, we're really aiming to be as close to this fold as possible, and sometimes we're not perfect, but if we get close, and the more times you do it, the more accurate you're going to be.
All right.
Okay, so once that's done, we can go ahead and do the side seam and the underarm seam. So just to make sure everything is the way it should be, I first start and make sure that everything matches up. The underarm seam matches and the end of the sleeve matches. If it doesn't, you've made an error someplace. So make sure that that's all good. And then start here. Now this is a 5/8 inch seam allowance. The only one I think in the pattern. And the reason we leave this 5/8 is because a lot of traditional shirt makers like to do either a French seam here or a flat felled seam. But we're going to stick with the pattern guide and do a 5/8 and then serge it. Always make sure that everything's matching up. The minute you find that it's not, then you need to stop. Okay, come down here, make sure that everything's matching, and it is. And you see that curve, it's matching perfect. This is the way patterns that are drafted properly lay together. And I tell you that because I know there are a lot of imposter pattern makers out there. I get emails weekly about errors in patterns and or instructions being a little off. So it's just a little tip to see if that pattern was made properly. Okay, so now we have our seam, and now I'm going to serge this, and I'm going to trim off about 1/4 of an inch because I only want about 3/8 inch seam allowance in there that I'm going to top stitch down. If you have any questions, shoot them out, Jess. Now take note that when I serge, I always use an extension table. My chair's not quite as high as it should be. I don't even know if I can get it any higher. To be ergonomically correct right here. But if I was going to construct a whole garment at the serger, you better believe I would get that chair raised up. Okay, so we've serged that off, and now White Fang is going to press the seam allowance toward the back. So you want to get a really nice press, because then we're going to go in and we're going to top stitch that seam down. And again, I top stitch that seam down because I want it to stay in place and always look like a nice tailored shirt. They don't want that sloppiness in there. So I'll give you a quick demo on stitching that down, and then we're going to put the cuffs on. So while Brenda's doing that, I'm going to take my cuff and my cuff facing. Now I've marked these in advance because I specifically cut my cuff on the same stripe, the one on the right and the one on the left. So I want this to be the cuff, not the cuff facing. And I've even marked that I want this to be the top so that they will kind of match from left to right. So this is my facing, and I've also marked that by putting a little X on there. Okay, so now what I want to do while we're waiting is put a 1/4 inch mark on the seam allowance. So this is a seam allowance, is 1/4 inch on the cuff all the way around. So I'm just marking the seam allowance at the end, and the reason I'm doing that will be obvious in as we construct it. So there's some prep work. You just want a 1/4 inch. Are you ready, Brent? Okay. Oh, thanks. All right. So now, who was that you were talking to about the dog? Tell him he stole your chair. Stole your chair. Okay. So for this, I'm going to want the sleeve inside out. And I'm going to start at the bottom, and I'm going to stitch a needle width away, all the while the seam allowance is pressed toward, sorry. I wish there was an answer to that. All right, and again, so a needle width this way is where we want to be. Remember to follow the curve. Don't try and straighten that out while you're top stitching. It'll be kind of puckery and it won't hang nice. So just like everything else, always honor the curve. So with the shape of the garment. Now this is where it can get a little tricky because you're going to go down this little rabbit hole here. And it gets narrower the further you go. So you just smooth this out and stitch as far as you can. And then again, and you just sort of like inch your way down a few inches at a time. Now this is a step that can be left out. There are lots of patterns and lots of shirts that might not do this. But I'm giving you all my best tips. And then you can do with them as you please. This is just a tiny bit tedious. But it doesn't take long. Will this sleeve ever end? There we go. There's the end.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Having a camera issue.
Okay. So there it is. It's top stitched all the way, the underarm all the way down the side seam. And now we're ready to put the cuff on. So we're going to have the sleeve right side out now. And, okay, where did I put this? Oh. Okay, so we're going to take this, the cuff facing, okay, I'm going to put the cuff facing, and we're going to take that 1/4 of an inch and put it right past the edge of the cuff or the placket here. We're going to be stitching right along there, so we don't want to catch the placket, but we want to be smack right up against it. This is very similar to the burrito at the neckline. Now the cuff is a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around, because why would you want anything more? It's an enclosed seam. Enclosed seams are always 1/4 inch. Even in home sewing, when they have you stitch them at 5/8, step 2 is trim it to a 1/4. So we don't bother stitching it at 5/8. We draft it at a 1/4 to begin with, and then we're good. And we don't have all that fuss. And then we want to match up the 1/4 at the other end the same way. Just make sure everything is lining up. The cuff does fit perfectly, so if you've done everything right, make sure before you go to put your cuff on that you have put your pleat in. Now we're going to pop that cuff out, well, cuff facing, and I'm going to add the cuff to the cuff facing. Now that's my top, so I know I want to do it this way. Now, we want to get this placket. Let me lay this where they can see what I'm doing here, Jess. Okay, we want that placket out of the way. Which is the top? That's the top. Okay. So that we can, so that we can stitch this at the 1/4 inch. Now you can leave it right there, but it might get in your way, so if you just fold it back a hair, and then you can stitch up the 1/4 inch seam allowance. You should be able to feel it as well as have it marked. And in either case, make sure you don't catch that placket. Okay, we're going to get this all matched up here. Turn that corner and okay, and then the same thing here. I want this out of the way. Now, before we do our burrito, we want to make sure that we got close enough without catching the placket. So I'm going to pull this back, and yep, I'm right next to it. And over here. Okay, over here, we caught it. So, I'll just pop that out and slide it back a little bit. That's why we always check, because sometimes I do catch it. You may catch it sometimes too. There we go. Okay, we're good now. So now we're going to burrito. Remember the burrito. We'll fold this, just fold the placket up in there, and you just want to stitch along this seam allowance a few, maybe an inch. So again, here's where we're at. I think I might be confusing you, so let me hold it. All right, so here's our sleeve. We've got our facing on. We've sewn our cuff to our facing. And now we want to slip that placket up in here and stitch across about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. But if you turn it over, you'll see the previous stitching. And that's the stitching you want to either stitch on or be just above, just like with the collar stand burrito. Make sure everything's lined up. There's no substitute for that. And make sure that you're either on that or above it. So I've stitched either on it or above it right here. I'll do the same thing over here. Just going to flip that placket up in there. Get these lined up real nice. And then again, about 1 inch, 1.5 inches. You don't need to try to go as far as you can. There's no point in it, and I'll show you why in a sec. Okay, so now what we want to do is trim all 4 corners, and you want to trim more than just that corner because we don't want bulk in here. And so when we flip this over, we don't want anything laying on top of itself. So that's going to work there. Take some of this out. Do the same thing over here. And then we're going to turn it right side out. And you want some kind of a point turner. This is my favorite. You can buy them at Joann's. It's made by Dritz. It's not only a point turner, but it's also a button gauge. So it can come in handy for a couple of things. This is my favorite one. And we're just going to get those corners out nice and square. That one just popped right out by itself. Okay, so there's what we have. Now, in preparation for the show, I started the cuff on the other side, so you wouldn't have to wait for us to do all that extra pressing. So, but what I have done, oops, is I pressed the seam allowance up into the cuff real nice and neat. And I think I prefer to do this with the sleeve inside out. And now we're going to top stitch all the way around the cuff, starting at one of our endings of our burrito. Okay, so let's see, probably this one. Now the key to this is, you see our previous stitching, we want that fold to land on there so that we're stitching right on top of that previous stitching. So that's your goal. So once I get it started, I'm going to come back here and turn it under a quarter. And just like I showed you with the placket, once you've turned it under a quarter at both ends and you put a little tension on it, it just wants to turn under the whole way. So now it's just easy peasy. And again, I am stitching a needle width away. If all you're going to do is go around it once, I prefer needle width away. There are a lot of ready-to-wears that'll do this at a quarter and not a needle width away. But if I do it, I'm going to do a needle width away, and then if I want that 1/4 inch, then I'll go back and do a second row a 1/4 inch from the first row. And that gives it a nice double top stitch. A nice sporty look. You guys, we're almost done here. Catch up with where you left off. This navy on navy is hard to see. Okay, and then just lock it in there. Didn't cut it for some reason. Okay, and there is our cuff. Alright, so now all you have left to do is buttons and buttonholes, or buttonholes and buttons, as it were. Now, since this is a women's shirt, the buttonholes go on the right side. I need just a little more work. Okay. So, you will notice at the end of the book, we're going to give you, and we do this, this is, for me, the only way to put buttonholes in. And that is, the buttonhole goes on that center front line. And remember way back when we cut it out, we specifically designated the center front, and we generally, many of us drew a chalk line there. So you may still have your center chalk line. But if you don't, you can put it back on, which, here, let me open this up now so we don't have any distortion. Lay it out nice and flat. Okay. And then take your gridded ruler, and mine happens to be right here at the center of this white line, and I believe it's a 1/2 inch from the folded edge. But double check that with your pattern. And then I would just take my chalkener. Where'd my pink one go? Oh, there it is. And just chalk the line all the way down. And if you keep a straight line all the way down, then your buttonholes won't be over here and zigzagging around. They'll be right on this line. So that's why I do that. All the way. Then, the first buttonhole goes in the placket, but then after that, you want to find your bust line. So, right on your bust line, you want to put the first button. And every button after that, the buttonholes are 3 inches apart. So from the bottom of this buttonhole to starting the top of this one is 3 inches. So for example, if this was my placket, since I haven't tested this on Brenda to know. If this was my placket and this was my bust line, I would make a cross mark here, and then my buttonholes are generally a 1/2 inch. I know that my buttonhole's 1/2 inch long, so then I mark this one. Okay, so there's one buttonhole. Now notice that I make my marks really long, and the reason I do that, probably make them even longer than this, is because when you set down a buttonhole foot or a buttonhole attachment, all this disappears. And all you can see is just a little bit right here. I want to be able to see that I'm starting and stopping in the right place. So if these long lines are really nice and long, even though I have a buttonhole foot or attachment blocking all this, I can still see peripherally where to start and stop. So then that's the bottom of that buttonhole. So I'm going to come down 3 inches. Mark the top of that buttonhole. Make sure you keep everything perpendicular. That's what these clear gridded rulers are so good for. And then another 1/2 inch buttonhole. And just so on down. And just follow the directions on marking that buttonhole. And of course, you're going to have a buttonhole in the center here. For people that have the buttonhole attachment that is a foot with a big long piece of plastic that you stick your button in, this is going to be very difficult. That foot catches up on the seam allowance. And I have a horrible time. I wouldn't even use one of those to do a placket. So before you try and do that on a placket, if that's the only buttonhole attachment you have, do a sample. Or a lot of machines will have directions in the manual how to do a manual buttonhole. Myself, and those of you who have been watching us here on Tuesdays at 2 for a long time, you know that I prefer the old school Greist buttonhole attachment. And I'll give you a quick view of my new ones next week. I just went out and purchased a couple of old metal machines that do zigzag. They're the best ones to hook up and just have over sitting in the corner to do all your buttonholes. So I'll go into that next week. But this is how you mark them. You got to mark them on the cuff and on the collar stand. You put your buttonholes in. After you get your buttonholes in, you want to mark where the buttons go. And again, because we are marking according to our bust line with the first button, so we don't have that gaposis here at the bust line, you can't have marked the buttons in advance. Okay, so what you're going to do is line up, make sure your fronts are even, and then you're going to lay the buttonhole over top. Okay, let's say, where's my example? Okay, so this was my buttonhole. It's right here. Okay, so this is my pocket, and this is my buttonhole. And then I'm going to take a pin, and I'm going to mark the center of that buttonhole right here on the placket. So this is going to be laying right where it should be, and I'm going to mark that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this pin in here, and sometimes I put 2 pins in order to create a spacer when I sew the button in. So buttons should be sewn where the thread stays nice and smooth, but there should be some movement in that button. I know what a lot of amateurs do when they don't sew, but they have to sew a button back on. They sew it on real tight, and they think that's great, it won't come off. Yeah, but now you can't button it either because there's no space between it and for you to get it up in here. It'll just pucker it. So if you have that problem, that's why. So make sure that you have that spacer. Then you can get that stitching and pull it fairly snug and keep it nice and smooth. And then when you remove these pins, then you've got that little bit of give in your button. And they use, if you're hand stitching, you can use this. There's a spacer here that it's not real thick, so this would be great for a shirt. So you would lay this on that spot and then sew your button in that way. Or here's even a thicker one for like coats and jackets if you need a lot of extra leeway. Okay, I think that's it. I know, Jessica said, you're going to get all that done today?
It's a long sheet. All right, I'm going to turn this around. I do have a question for you.
All right.
You know, I don't know where I'm going to sit. Oh, okay. All right, so Brenda is asking, Brenda Ryder.
Hi, Brenda.
Let's this.
I'm Mitzi. I need to sit closer to you.
Brenda is wondering, do you ever use your featherweight for buttonholes?
I have not. I do have a buttonhole attachment for my featherweight, but I've never tried it. Brenda, I have like 12 or 13 buttonhole attachments, and I'm in the process now of trying to find machines that work with all of them.
Maybe you'll just see them in a live sale one day.
Oh, no, I can't let them go. It's a very weird obsession I have.
You won't be here.
Oh, no. I have to hide them.
Marlene says, I tape my buttons down and then use a toothpick as a spacer.
Sure.
Yep.
That works good, too.
Nancy says, I've been making my buttonholes on my embroidery machine. It makes beautiful ones, unlike the sewing machine.
Oh, I'd have to agree with you. I just, when I have to put in 14 buttonholes, I don't want to hoop them up. So that, again, is why I use the Grice. And the Grice gives you beautiful buttonholes as well.
Yep, and Pamela says, I much prefer the buttonholes on my old 1963 Kenmore.
I just bought one.
Yep. Ay.
They're so heavy, though. Oh, my gosh. I went to the
workout in?
Oh, no. I couldn't even. No, they're heavier than that. It's like you can only. I couldn't get all the way to the end of the room carrying it. I had to put it down. It's that heavy. So anyway, yeah, that the more current machines are not doing justice to buttonholes, and that's all there is to it. I don't know why. There's no reason. They do beautiful, beautiful zigzags. They do really nice wide ones. Not that you need wide ones for buttonholes. But a beautiful, if it does a beautiful satin stitch, it should do a decent buttonhole. But I won't even belabor all the problems, but we know what they are. The buttonholes aren't even. One comes out good. The next one cuts off too short. The next one goes too long on one side. And man, are they hard to tear out.
Yeah. You don't want to do that. So then don't forget you didn't remind them about their stitch sample.
Oh, yeah. You want to use your stitch sample to do your buttonhole testing. I actually been doing that. Let me get my stitch sample so you can see. Because I bought that old Kenmore and I've been trusting out my Grist on it, you can see the stitch sample is really getting a workout.
Let me get it a little bit closer for you.
I don't know if that's the right side or the wrong side, but
that's there we go. There's a lot happening here. Oh, Nancy says that regarding the embroidery machine, that she just lays them on top of paper stabilizer so she doesn't have to hoop.
So you paper like is it the sticky stuff? Because or maybe she just stitches them around. I don't know.
Brenda wants to know if you have any more tips for getting the buttonholer to line up where you want the holes. Mine always goes askew.
Okay, so the buttonholer. Now, are you using a buttonhole attachment or a buttonhole foot? In either case, I will tell you what my grandmother taught me many, many years ago, and we used the buttonhole attachment on the straight stitch Singer machine and everything. She took the thread out of the needle and ran it around the buttonhole area one time to make sure it was going to be straight. And then if you don't move it and you don't lift the foot, it's going to go right back in the same place for you. So that is one way.
She said yes, attachment.
Okay, so if you're using a buttonhole attachment, just make sure it's nice and straight. But there is the dog. Let me get my attachment. Okay, so here's my attachment. There is a line right here. No. Oh, I'm doing the wrong thing. There is a registration mark at either end of the buttonhole. And if you've done that long line like I talked about, and these big long lines that go across here, you can get that centered and get your needle. There. So you see what I'm saying? Is that the kind of attachment that you have or something similar? We'll wait. But that's what I do. And again, that is why I make those lines so long. So I know, and then I sink that needle right in the crosshairs of the bottom of that buttonhole when I know that I'm at the bottom of the buttonhole with the attachment.
Oh, Brenda. She says, oops, I meant foot.
Well, it's the same thing, Brenda. It's the same thing. It depends on your machine. I'm not familiar with every buttonhole foot. I don't like most of them. But you want to make sure that that's why we're doing those long lines in both directions so you can hit that bottom of that buttonhole. Because when you make a buttonhole, you start at the bottom and go around twice, usually. So you just want to make sure you get it in the right place and that it's straight, and then it will automatically do its thing after that.
All right, Celine says, don't understand why marking lines so far apart on marking buttonhole.
So far apart. Okay, so we drew, well, it's right here in the book. So go ahead and look at page 22 and you're going to see. We're doing the center front line down the whole length of the shirt. That way, when we mark the top and the bottom of each buttonhole, we know they're going to be in alignment. They can't get out of alignment. Too often, if you don't do that and you mark each buttonhole separately, then one could be 1/8 of an inch to the right. The next one could be 1/8 of an inch to the left. And pretty soon you got a zigzags of your buttonholes. So that's why we do the straight line. Then we mark the top and the bottom of each buttonhole, and we make them very wide so that whatever foot or attachment we're sitting down. Okay, so like when I set this attachment down, remember this. Hold this up, Jets.
Nah.
When I set this down, it's going to cover up so much that I want to be able to see the lines on either side. So I don't know how well I'm doing with this demo here. But can you see the lines on either side?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's the point of the top and the bottom of the buttonhole, the center of the buttonhole, making them wide so I can see when I put my foot or my attachment down. No guesswork. Nobody wants to rip out buttonholes, and we sure don't want them misaligned.
She says, okay, makes sense.
Okay, good.
Good, good, good.
Good, good.
All right, if there are more questions, feel free to shout them out. But as we mentioned at the beginning, when we talked about, was it Deb? That was making 2?
Yeah, somebody was making 2, but I don't remember.
Oh, sorry. So quickly. I lost.
Scroll back.
I tried already. It only goes back so far. Oh, wait, one more. Can you please show the placket on the cuff? Does it open towards the front? I'm not sure if I've got this the right way around.
It has to open toward the back, but we could be speaking the same thing in 2 different languages. So, this okay, this is the back of the sleeve. So it folds toward the back. Same with the pleat over here, folds toward the back. How do I know what the back is? It's the smaller portion of the sleeve. Remember, it's a 2-piece sleeve. This narrow piece is toward the back. So that'll help keep you oriented as well. So it folds toward the back. The pleat goes toward the back. So everything goes away from your arm.
Does that help, Pam? And I was right. Mary says it was Deb that has made 2.
Okay.
Why do I question myself?
I don't know. Because you got up at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Not intentionally. Okay, so if you have done sew-alongs with us in the past, you know that we have offered a little incentive for those of you who get your project done, whatever the sew-along may be. So again, we want to offer that to you. We know that a lot of you are still working on your muslins, so we wanted to make sure we give you enough time. We typically give you a couple weeks to finish up and everything, but like I said, we know you're still working on your muslins. Not Deb. She already has 2 done. Good job, Deb. So what we're going to say is if you could post a picture of your finished Everybody shirt. Now, it could be on you. It could be on the person you made it for. It could be on a dress form. It could be hanging on a hanger. Just make sure it looks nice.
We prefer it on you.
On a body.
Because we want to see you.
You don't have to show your face if you don't want to. But anybody who posts a photo of... I know, but I said if they don't want to.
Okay.
Anybody who posts a photo by November 15th, that's a Monday. So you have till midnight.
You can post them right now. You can post them anytime.
Yeah, but you have until November 15th to finish your shirt and post it on our Facebook page. And then on the 16th, we will draw a winner for a fun prize.
Or maybe more.
Yeah.
So, yeah. You're going to be a winner when you finish this anyway. It's a beautiful shirt. You'll have learned a lot. And then you'll have a beautiful garment for your wardrobe. Let us help you if you have any questions. islandersewing@comcast.net. And you don't forget, you can watch this all on YouTube as well as on our Facebook.
Yep. Yep, Brenda, when we get done here, she usually gets it up onto YouTube sometime the end of tomorrow.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's available immediately on Facebook if you wanted to quick go back and see something that you missed. And like Janet said, if you want to reach us, islandersewing@comcast.net, and she'd be happy to help you.
Absolutely. So, what are we doing next week?
I'm gonna send you out of town and sell all your buttonholers.
I'll be back by Sunday.
All right. Well, I guess we'll leave it a surprise.
Okay.
All right. We'll see you all next week. Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern time.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have fun with your shirt.
Yeah, can't wait to see them.